Reaperman here with a little bit of Virtua Racing here on New Year's Eve evening. So let's get into some of it. I'll talk a little bit about what makes Virtua Racing so special to me. This is actually my second favorite version of Virtua Racing. My personal favorite version is the one that nobody likes on the Sega Saturn that isn't even by Sega. I tend to like that one a little more for pretty much exactly the same reason I like this one. I like that this game isn't afraid to keep users on the track for a good amount of laps and a good amount of time. It's not actually all that much time, but the Saturn version greatly even expands on that. So this is probably the earliest game that that gives me the same feeling as a modern racing title, where I'm chasing seconds, where I'm not caring if I'm out on the track for 20, 30, 40 minutes at a time. It doesn't matter at all to me, because it's all about the lap, the flow, all of that. And that's pretty different than a lot of the games that came before it. Other things that are a little different about this game, you can change your view, but it doesn't just flash from one view to the other, it transitions, so you can go all the way down into your cockpit. Straighten out a little bit here. You can jump all the way down into your cockpit, all the way up to way out here. Oops. And it's a fairly smooth transition. I prefer the default view down here, and that probably wasn't so good for my race there. But this was one of the first times that I can remember seeing this was on Virtua Racing. There's also a replay feature, which is absolutely excellent in this game, and I don't recall ever seeing things like that. Now this was back in the mid-90s here. Saturn hadn't come out. You may have seen some stuff like this on 3DO, and maybe I think that would be about the only system that could handle it back then. But fully 3D racing at a relatively smooth frame rate. I'm not saying it's 60 FPS here, it's probably more like 530. Really hard to say. I might count in post, or I might just let myself believe it's 60. It's definitely not 60. So this game has 3 cars in it. They've got a stock car, which is just tons of drifty hilarity. They've got this Formula 1 car here, which is considered, the medium one. This porridge is neither too hot nor too cold. And then they have a prototype racer, which seems to have no humor at all to it. It's a pretty serious machine. And I do like the prototype racer a good bit. It's probably my second favorite car, but I like just the overall balanced feel of this Formula 1 car, or Indy car, or whatever the heck it is. Now, as I recall, the Japanese version of this has a little better support for saving scores and that kind of thing. So I should probably look into playing that one instead, but for right now I'm going to stick with the one I grew up with, the American version. And this is the track that I always race. This game has a fair number of tracks in it, but I always race this one track. At least until I win it in a decent car. I've never actually won this track in either the open wheel car or the prototype car. And yes, I'm a wimp that races in automatic mode, because the cockpit load of going full manual is just a little much on me. Let's check out the replay here. The camera angles aren't the best, but for the time, this was about all you could get. A little bit about my setup, too, while we're watching this thing. So I'm playing this on a Sega Genesis 1 attached to a Sega CD2 with a little optional extendo platform, and then a 32x jammed into that, and a custom SCART cable for the 32x that connects up to the front of the Genesis to pipe stereo through the SCART cable itself, and that goes into my usual framemeister and avermedia live gamer portable 2 capture device. So it's a little complicated. There's also a custom power supply powering the whole thing. Sure, I'm glad I got one of those. So as you can see here, the angles are doing okay. It goes through a selection of both camera angles that were available in race on the car, as well as fixed camera angles and kind of a mix between them. But they definitely enjoyed playing with the camera position in this group a bit. You might notice that I'm playing on a fairly large controller. This is my Mass Super Stick for Sega Genesis. It's a fairly early controller of theirs, apparently, because it's made out of plywood on the back panel and the top panel, and some kind of lousy particle board on the sides and the front. And later on they'd switch to using the MDF that I tend to like a little more. But it seems like they were still finding their voice a little bit on this one. As you might notice here, the underside of this plywood panel is completely unfinished, and that doesn't seem much like them. Also, this controller was a little bit worse for wear when I got it. I got a kind of a bargain without a bottom. So I installed a plexiglass bottom on it, I guess, so I could laugh a bit at it. And at one point, the internals must have failed on this thing because it's been kind of crudely pad hacked. And it's been pad hacked in a way where to change the switches out, which are now starting to go, would be just kind of more hassle than this controller's worth. But I still like it because it's got those big old style hap controls, not the new China hap, but the actual old hap. And it gives kind of a sense of occasion when I'm playing arcade racing games, especially, well, not to mention fighting games. And the spring on the stick is just a little heavy for shmups, but I still try and do it anyway. It never really works out. I think we're done probably watching this thing. Let's go for another round here. So you can stop this by smashing down all the buttons and start. And that'll bring you back here. And it's weird because in the menu, A and B A is your choose button and B is your cancel button. But in the game, B is your accelerator and A is your brake. Which is kind of weird that you're selecting all this stuff with the brake. So I'm usually good in this car for about 5th place. And there's a few corners that I know that I just don't know how to take in this. I'm actually a little better at taking them with the faster prototype car. At least I think it's faster. I'm faster in the prototype car. Because the prototype car clearly requires the brake. And this car is just slow enough that it might not require the brake all the time. So it tempts me to push it harder than I would push the other car. This is the corner I really don't know how to take in this thing. It's much easier in the prototype car. Also, the corner immediately at the end of this straightaway in the prototype car is much easier to take than this one, because this one I could probably make it without braking. But no. And I know I can make it without braking, but without letting off the gas, I guess I should say. But I really love this game. I love hunting for my high scores, hunting for just that extra 10 seconds, well, 1/10 of a second a lap. I like that I'm out here for nearly 5 minutes a race, none of this 2-minute stuff like in the default Gran Turismo or something like that. And this really feels like a nice modern racer. I think everybody should check this one out at least once. And the 32x version seems to be everybody but my favorite version of the game. It runs a lot smoother than the Genesis version, and if you have a 32x attached, you cannot play the Genesis version, so that makes it considerably more appealing right there. I do like the Genesis version, though. There is a neat little effect at the initial Sega logo that is, if I recall, really neat. The big Sega with the little Segas in it is my memory of that. Although I really haven't played nearly as much of that game because it's nowhere near as fun as this one. So right in this era, there was just a whole bunch of games trying to do the full 3D polygon racer thing, probably before they really had the hardware to do it. In addition to the Sega Virtua Racing on the Genesis, there was Jaguar had Checkered Flag. They're trying real hard to compete with that, and I don't know. As much as I have tried to pretend that I like Checkered Flag in the past, I really just, it's not this game. This game is just so much better. And it's not as if one of them is more realistic and I'm somehow failing the controls. It's just not as smooth, not as nice, and that's generally the story with most of the 32x and Jaguar competitions. I'd say it's a lot closer to the Genesis version though, just in terms of frame rate and draw distance. I do tend to prefer the music on the Jaguar Checkered Flag over Virtua Racing. So Virtua Racing's got these little jingles that come up when you pass a checkpoint, and that's all it's got for music. The Jaguar's got some pretty interesting tunes. About the best one is the menu tune. Well, I can't remember if there's anything in Race or not. I should probably go back and check before I talk too much on that subject. I'm sure I'm going to be a little faster if I switch over to the manual cars. But I think there's just too much going on for me to keep track of that. I also think that it uses up and down to handle shifting, which is not great, because it seems like all of these other buttons are bound to different views that you can switch the car into. Ooh. So this is a nice hypnotizing racer. You know the corners, you know the course. That's probably because I only raced the first course. But you can just kind of let go and get into the groove. The race is long enough for you to have that experience. And there's no tire wear. I believe you can pit. Don't know why you would want to. There must be some form of race mode that uses it here in the game. As you saw, I started in the pits for this mode. Wasn't very nice. Actually doing very, very poorly on this race. I guess I'm not doing that poorly. I thought I was farther in it than I was. Because again, I'm usually good for 5th place in this particular car. So coming up, I would like to do a whole lot more Genesis games, and I've got my setup here for it. Part of the reason I drug it out is I wanted to use this controller for the first time to play Street Fighter 2, which I did earlier today, and I wanted to just kind of get accustomed to how Street Fighter 2 played for when I get my arcade board wired up with the extra buttons and all that, so I'm not totally out of it. And Genesis has a great version. The Street Fighter 2 version I own is Turbo, which I believe is the last version with the basic 12 fighters. Ooh. And the Genesis version, the non-super one, is actually very close to it, as near as I can see. One thing I do notice is that the game is very easy on Genesis, at least at default difficulty level, so I'm going to have to play with that a little bit, or else this arcade board is just going to trounce me. But it's nice to get out the big, heavy controller here, and I think this is probably the heaviest controller I own, is this particular ginormous mass stick. I own a fair number of arcade sticks, and I even have a couple in the mail. I think that's enough to get a good idea of the game here.